this is the third week. I can't believe it. But week 3 of ADHD Awareness Month. And we are today going to be talking about how to find and keep a job with ADHD. And here's some of Justy's story. So we are very excited to have her here. And she's on the other side of the world. So so I am also very excited and appreciate dealing with like different time zones and stuff.
Yeah,
so
it's
so
9:30 p.m. here.
oh, thank you for coming on. So do you mind introducing yourself and telling us your story?
Yeah, so I'm Justyna, or Justine, however you want to call me, and I'm an ADHD coach. And first thing I want to say is that I'm gonna use a lot of notes. I already told Megan that my working memory is terrible. And even when I do ADHD coaching with my clients, I need to note all the time because it's just evaporating. So excuse me for reading, but I called this personal story and experience part of this webinar as hummingbirds and head-heart alignment.
Okay.
Because I think this head-heart alignment is what's crucial for the topic of this webinar, which is finding and keeping a job. Mm-hmm. So I don't want to go too long on my story, but I think it can be relatable for many ADHDers, and that's why I want to share it. And it can show the power of the awareness of ADHD, which is also very crucial for Central Europe, where I'm based. I'm based in Poland. So, yeah, let's just start with the first chapter of my story is beginning psychotherapy.
Oh, okay.
So,
good. I'm glad you started there because last week we talked a lot about therapy. So this is a good continuation.
Yeah. So when I was 30, I was in psychotherapy and I was trying to make sense of things that didn't quite work, but it already lasted few years and there were things that we couldn't overcome with my therapist. So one day she suggested, Justyna, you might be autistic. Mm-hmm. And I started to read about it. And I realized that autism and ADHD often go hand in hand. So I started to dive deeper into the topic of ADHD, and I just read my bio, reading the ADHD traits. Mm-hmm. So, yeah, I decided to pursue an ADHD diagnosis, and everything suddenly started to make sense. Especially the job hopping, which was my thing. Impulsive decisions also when it comes to my professional life, and that constant itch to chase something new. And all of this suddenly had an explanation. And by this time, I was struggling a lot with depression. And the depression was also caused by this indecisiveness or this impulsiveness. So the ADHD diagnosis gave me a huge relief, mm-hmm. But it didn't make my life less chaotic. I was still a hummingbird, as I call it, flying from one flower to the other. And coming back to my teens, when I want to show the journey of my job searching, was when I was 14, I started to work as a model. And I worked there for a few years. But then I remember finding myself working in China as a model, as a 16-year-old girl, chasing her dreams. And then I thought, no, I should go to the university. So I started studying physics. And because I was, this is the power of ADHDers when they're interested in something. I read some books by Stephen Hawking. I had a very charismatic teacher in high school, and I decided I'll be a physicist. After 2 years of studying physics, I jumped into cultural anthropology because it suddenly started to be more interesting. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah, that's exactly what happens, right? You find your what you like right now and what's exciting to you right now, and then you jump into another position.
Yeah, exactly. And uh, also this constant feeling like it's starting with challenges. Like I try to tell you also a little bit of the ADHD challenges, which is constantly hearing from the environment, especially when you're not diagnosed, that you should choose one thing and stick to it.
Yeah, that
And
statement probably drives me crazy.
yes, and it also undermines the self-confidence a lot.
Mm-hmm.
And then I studied anthropology. I had a gap year. I was traveling around the world. I worked at the time. I worked in a book publishing company, and my creativity was an asset there because I was writing text for ads. But I quickly became bored, and I switched to work in hospitality in the UK. I moved countries because Poland was boring already. So I worked in hospitality in a nursing home. I was a babysitter. I taught English to kids whom I always connected with. I also worked in the corporate world. In
So
the
you've done
meantime,
you've done everything.
done everything. And in the
You've done
meantime, I
everything.
completed programming course because I wanted to be an IT woman.
So
Yeah, but
physicist to
yeah,
IT to hospitality to watching children to traveling to programming. Yes, that it has ADHD written all over it.
yeah. And it was all before I was diagnosed.
Mm-hmm.
There were also the huge amount of ADHD tax as I was changing hobbies and buying this new sewing machine, which I gave up on after 2 months. So now I know when to say to myself, maybe just don't buy this pottery wheel yet, unless you're more grounded in this hobby.
Yes, but if you do have anybody that's listening and you do have a hobby that you no longer give up, I feel like we should have a little support group where you just kind of pass the hobby materials
Yeah.
from one ADHD to the next.
Yes. Um, yes. So that all happened. And then I found ADHD coaching.
Mm-hmm.
And I found it straight. I got my diagnosis and straight I started to search for ADHD coaching opportunities. And I signed up for this course, and I'll admit my expectations weren't high as I had a long history of not sticking to one thing.
Mm-hmm.
But this time it was different. I felt, as I mentioned at the beginning, this head and heart aligned, and I realized that ADHD wasn't just the thing I had to manage, but also I could help others with.
Mm-hmm.
So that sparked my passion. And I'm an empath, as many ADHDers, we are empaths. So I felt like this tingling sensation in my heart, like, oh, maybe I found the thing I will stay in. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
And what's also, there is some miraculous events going on because at the time I was working in a corporate job and there was a group redundancy. So
Mm-hmm.
I was made redundant and I had
Okay.
nothing on my plate except ADHD coaching course. So I decided I'll dive deep into coaching, and the corporate basically made a life decision for me, which
Yeah.
was very stressful, but also very beneficial for my current career. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's what happens, right? Well, sometimes when we're let go from positions, it opens up doors. So when one door closes, another one opens. So that's exciting to hear that you didn't stay in a negative place because you were let go from one position, but you transitioned over to something that you were a little bit more passionate about. and you felt like that your head and your heart were aligned in that move.
Yeah. I think there are vital ingredients, like hopping a little bit to the strategies on finding and keeping a job.
Mm-hmm.
There are vital ingredients, at least for me, which can help. They might sound a bit vague, but I think if we dive into them, they might be more understandable. First of all is this head and heart alignment,
Mm-hmm.
but of course also sense of purpose. For me, it was difficult to find it in different jobs where I was feeling a little bit more like a pawn in some huge machinery. It was difficult for me personally. But here with coaching, and I could see the change in my clients, it's something else. And also in the ADHD coaching world, there is this deep sense of community.
Mm-hmm.
And I think this is also very important for ADHDers to stick to the job when there is great work environment, where there are nice people you can talk to, even one person.
Mm-hmm.
That can be sort of life-changing. But also sense of challenge,
Mm-hmm.
which is also very important for our brains, that we can grow, we have opportunity to excel, to change the position to something even more interesting. And yeah, this opportunities to learn, as we love learning, at least many of us love learning, and we are curious about the world. I'm not saying that every ADHDer should be an entrepreneur. And no, I think it's a great idea.
Yeah, I mean, you do find a lot of people with ADHD walking into the entrepreneurship lane for sure, because you just have that autonomy and to be able to do what you want, and you're also not being fall victim to some of the negative parts of working in like organizational cultures, like group cultures and corporate and things that may not necessarily align with your overall character or your values.
Yeah.
And your value systems. And entrepreneurship allows you to position yourself to be very clear about what your values are, and to be able to live in those values without having them being questioned.
Yeah, even though there are pros and cons, and for me the biggest challenge was lack of structure.
Mm-hmm.
The structure which I had to create by myself, and it took a lot of time to build this structure, to structure my day, to set the tasks for myself.
Mm-hmm.
So this is also very important when looking for the perfect employer.
Mm-hmm.
To find somebody who gives clear expectations,
mm-hmm.
Who can give not too limiting, but the structure.
Yeah.
So it's easier for us then.
I'm going to reiterate some of the things that you had just mentioned for some of the people that are just joining. So again, we're talking about like how to find and keep a job with ADHD. And so we talked about a couple things. So one, when you're looking for a position, or if you're starting your own company and trying to ensure that your heart and your head are aligned and you are feeling like you're walking in some type of purpose. Another thing is like creating an environment and having some deep sense of community where you are, and ensuring that is there within your work environment. So like if you're looking for a 9-to-5, then you're asking some questions about the organizational culture when you're interviewing. The other thing that she had mentioned was having a sense of challenge in your job. So are you going to be challenged? Is there going to be something new? Is there something that will keep you engaged and spark that interest and engage your creativity part of your brain? To keep you kind of engaged into the work versus doing the same thing over and over and over and over and over again until your face turns blue. Then the other thing you had mentioned is ensuring that there's opportunities to learn. And so again, that spark of curiosity. So ensuring that you're working for somebody that provides you the opportunities to learn new things. And something that you mentioned that didn't necessarily put on your list, but something you just talked about actually is the importance of having some type of structure and clear expectations. So again, like if you are, whether or not you're working for yourself or you're working for somebody else, you need that structure. So, you know, if you're working for yourself, you have to create it yourself. If you're working for somebody else, ensuring that they have systems in place that provide you that structure and not walking into the environment thinking that there's going to be the structure there, but really being intentional about asking whether or not that structure is there. And if it's not there, then asking to see if you can be positioned to be in a place to help create that structure that you need, because not having it is not going to be helpful
Yeah,
at all.
exactly. I'm amazed how you put it all together in so short
Oh
amount
yeah,
of time.
I've been told that I'm really good at summarizing all of the things that people talk about. I think that's one of my superpowers is like hearing. One of my ADHD superpowers is literally being able to hear a whole bunch of information and just being able to pull out the pieces
Mhm.
that are relevant, or not necessarily relevant because that sounds rude, but just the synopsis of what people said and just be able to put it together
Yeah.
and just kind of reiterate it and bring it back. And so, yeah, I get that feedback from my clients too. um, but we did have a question in the people that are viewing. It says, with new self-awareness of ADHD and your related strengths, how have you been able to utilize them now in your work?
Oh my God, it's a huge topic and it's a great question and a big topic. I have more of my notes here, but uh, first of all, the self-awareness itself, it changes a lot. You
Mm-hmm.
don't have to sometimes you don't have to do additional work because being self-aware makes you pause somehow.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, for example, it's not job related, but with buying this pottery wheel for your new hobby. When
Mm-hmm.
you're aware that it might be your brain wiring,
Mm-hmm.
you by default ask yourself the second time, do I need it?
Mm-hmm.
So I think self-awareness in itself is something that changes your life. But
Yeah.
also with this diagnosis, what came to me is focusing on my strength, less stigma, which I also put on myself, and that gave me confidence. And also looking at my past sort of failures when it comes to sticking to one job made me realize that the setbacks were leading me into something better.
Mm-hmm.
And this is the positive outlook on the world, which in the past, with me being not diagnosed, was more negative. So I would look at it as, oh, you failed again. You're not worthy. And with such attitude, it's difficult to write to Megan to let's make a webinar or live Instagram
Right.
together, because I would feel like, oh, I'm not good enough or something like that. Yeah.
Right. I can actually answer that question too. Thinking about ever since I became diagnosed with ADHD, it really forced me to pay attention to what my strengths are, because I think I struggled with identifying them, or not. Let me think. I think it it forced me to identify my strengths, because I think I was then positioned to ask myself what my strengths were in a different lens, because I better understood how my brain worked.
Mm.
Because before people would ask you what your strengths are, and you take all of these strength-based assessments, and sometimes you understand them and sometimes you don't. Sometimes it feels like you connect to it, sometimes it doesn't. But the information doesn't necessarily stick. But now I think because I really have a better understanding of how my brain works, and I've also accepted how my brain works, it positions me to I'd be able to identify my strengths, and then positions me to try to only use them also.
Mm.
And so if I'm going to be in a position to use my weaker, like executive functions or things that I'm not as necessarily strong at, then now I know that I need to build in some accommodations or put in some other strategies in place so that I don't end up in a negative loop cycle. Right. And so,
Exactly.
yeah, increasing that self-awareness. Like, before I was diagnosed with ADHD, 100, and I would have bet money that I was like the most self-aware person ever in life, right? If you would have asked me, I would have like, of course I'm self-aware. Like, are you kidding me? Like, no, there's no question about it at all. And then I got an ADHD diagnosis, and I was like, yeah, I didn't know anything about myself prior to that.
I think that's the story of many.
I'm like, I didn't know anything.
But what I wanted to say is that when you said about this gap, because I always start my coaching with clients with them feeling this via character strength test.
Okay,
And
yeah.
I often feel that, as you said, we have this on the paper, what are your strengths, but it doesn't glue to the person for some reason.
Mm-hmm.
And what you said made me realize that we have to be sort of ready and self-aware and already in some sort of positive mindset to absorb it.
Mm-hmm.
Because if we doubting ourselves and we see the strength, it just doesn't click sometimes.
Yeah, and then what you just reminded me of actually is like when you're now thinking about looking for a position, or you're trying to find a new job, right? Or you're trying to decide whether or not you want to stay at a particular job. It's once you get a better idea of what your strengths are, then take a look at what it is that you're actually doing right now. And are you in a position where you are maximizing those opportunities to use your strengths, or are you positioned to, are your strengths being ignored? Are people not acknowledging what your strengths are? Are you communicating your strengths to other people so people know them? Or are you in a position where you're constantly being chastised, or you're constantly being asked to do things that stress your weaker executive functions without some additional supports? And so, when you're thinking about finding a job or keeping a job, it's starting to ask yourself these questions. But it does require you to better understand yourself, and understand how your brain works. So yeah, especially when you're doing the job hunt, right? Your job hunting, and you're reading all these position descriptions. Is it something, when you're reading the positions, like, do you feel it inside? Like, yes, oh my God, this is something that I actually really want to do. So this is kind of going back to Jesse's points. Like, do you feel an internal sensation about like that your head and your heart aligns when, like, does what you're reading get you excited about it? Also, like when you're interviewing people, like your intuition is important, right? And so when you're doing these interviews and you're thinking about, okay, what are they saying? And like, is my heart and my head feeling like it's being aligned in this particular content? And remember, when you're interviewing for a job, you're also interviewing them. Like you're interviewing the company just as much as the company is interviewing you, right? And so you need to understand, like, what are your physical cues when you're talking to these companies, when you're reading the position description, when you're Googling the company, and does it feel like your heart and your head is aligned in that particular situation? And the same thing with the sense of purpose. And that one is tricky too, I feel like, because sometimes your purpose is just to get a job right now because you have some bills to pay. And recognizing that that's okay.
Yeah.
Like, if you just need permission to just have a job because you have some bills to pay, then here I am to give you permission. Because that's true. And also sometimes you may be having a full-time job, but then you want to just do something fun on the side, and just recognizing that you don't have to limit yourself. And I love the fact, and although this happens to a lot of ADHDers, and we're jumping from one job to the next for a bunch of different reasons, right? Because maybe we aren't aligned, and maybe we impulsively quit, and maybe we got fired, or something that happens in those transitions. But recognizing that there is a benefit for that also, because you've learned something. You learn something about yourself. You learn something about the company. You learn something about your interest, and what you're not interested in. So when you are looking for the next thing, you have the opportunity to use that information as well. Yeah,
I think what you've just said is a lot about giving yourself permission to operate in the world with this minimized self-doubt, which often, or diagnosis, is our dark side, let's say. But also what you said about sharing your strengths with others and sort of when they sink in into you and you're ready to do that. We are gonna talk also briefly about the differences between Central Europe and the USA.
Oh yeah.
So I just wanted to tell that there is this misconception, in my opinion, it's misconception or it's just mentality. For example, in Poland, when when you talk about your strengths or when you show the positive side of yourself, it's considered as bragging or it's considered as, you know, you too full of
Oh,
yourself.
that's interesting.
Whereas it's of course, there is a difference between bragging about yourself and being conscious of your strengths. But I think for job interviews, that's crucial thing. Yeah, to be able to acknowledge them and to present them to the potential employer.
Yeah. Thank you for bringing that up. I do have a point I want to make a point about that in a second. We do have a couple of questions. What do you do when the position description changes after you take the job? The bait and switch, essentially.
Mm.
So that happens all the time, unfortunately.
Oh.
So, I mean, I have a couple of thoughts about that in particular. So I have a couple of thoughts about that. One, I do you so one thing is like, is this change in your job description okay with you? That's one question you should ask yourself, because sometimes the job does change, but it can change in your benefit and it can change in something that you actually are more interested in. And so some companies, once they have a better clear understanding of your strengths and what you can bring to the table, or their needs may shift, you have the opportunity to do other positions, right? And so in some cases you may actually like the changes. Either way, if there are changes, everybody should be getting a new job description. Let me just put that, make from, the HR part of me says, if your job is changing, then you need to get a new job description, and making sure that that is clear. And so, communicating with your manager, be like, hey, this is a new job, and then, positions you to kind of renegotiate as well. But if it has switched over to something that you're not interested in, then, that's a completely different conversation. And I would suggest having that conversation with your employer. I hope that
Yeah.
answers your question.
Yeah, and also what's important in my opinion is to sort of use your intuition, whether it's still fine with you, the change. But what can be also valuable is during the interview to really, what we said before, to understand the clear expectations of the employer, and just to make sure that, okay, I'm going to do this and this. If you want to reveal your diagnosis, you can say that I need it because of my brain wiring. If you don't want to, I need it because I'm a human being and I need to know what I'm getting into. Yeah, I think it's
Yeah.
important to have this clarity in the very first
And you
stages.
need that clarity. So it also is relevant too, and this is why I say it's important to have a new job description written. So if you are like, and so again, I'm speaking for the United States. So if you are in the United States and you are asking for workplace accommodations for your position to help support you with that role, the company is required to ensure that they have a conversation with you around your essential job functions, and to help support you to meet those essential job functions with some different accommodations and strategy to put in place. But if your job is changing, and so your essential job functions are changing, it may actually mean that you need different accommodations. And so it's important to make the implicit explicit all of the time, and from just the employee perspective when it comes to like the HR. And I assume that a lot of disability rights, I don't know this because I'm clearly not familiar with disability laws in Poland, but I would assume that if you are in a position that is providing you a different accommodations, you need to know what it is that you're doing in order to know what accommodations to put in place. And so if things keep switching, then you need to go ahead and have an explicit conversation about that. Somebody had also asked, how open were employers to you being a hummingbird type of worker? Did they value the diversity of experiences the experiences you brought with you to the new positions? Sorry, I completely read that question wrong. Sorry. Did that make sense?
Yeah, I understood. Yeah. That's the challenge of writing your resume, which could have 4 pages, and you have to limit it to one and relevant. So maybe it's not very ethical what I'm gonna say, but I wasn't telling about everything I was doing to my new employers. During the onboarding process, I had to show all the papers, of course, and show my gap years and the years I worked in the UK, for example. But on the resume, before they hired me, I was just showing the relevant experience. So I didn't write for the corporate job as a recruiter that I worked in a nursing home. But what's interesting, there is still a lot of, as somebody asked this question very correctly, I think it's relevant to the state of the affairs in the job world, where if you don't have like this stable 7 years in one company or even 2 years, then you're not reliable worker. And this is part of the stigma. And I didn't clash with it so much, but I was always on entry level positions because of that.
So I would co-sign your thoughts about in terms of when you are job hopping or you're applying for new positions and you have different roles. I would say definitely when you're writing your resume, at the end of the day, regardless, you really should just be including the information that's relevant to the next job that you're applying for, because that's what they're going to be looking for. Like, do you have the experience and the knowledge needed to do the job that they're asking you to do? And so, if you worked at Disney World or something, but that has nothing to do with being a physicist, then like don't include it, right? But because it's just not relevant. And so, sometimes in conversation, some of those other experiences come up just as like people are getting to know you, and just like you're getting to know them, they'll come up. But you don't necessarily have to include all of the content on your resume if it's not relevant, because it's going to confuse the person that's reading it. As well. And so you just want to make sure that you're being clear about that. But the other point, I forgot what I wanted to say. Oh, the other thing is, I was just going to look it up a little bit, but I feel like I also think culturally, and I know this is true for the United States, you can speak to Central Europe or Poland specifically if you want to, around this next generation of workers. There is a lot more job hopping now than there was a couple of generations ago, right? And so, if you're in I guess I'm getting a little older now, so the 60s and 70s, like my mother and grandparents, like generation and stuff, like you went to one job and you stayed there forever.
Yeah.
And like you worked there for 30, 40, 50 years until you're retired. But that's not happening as much as now. And these younger generations are definitely declaring companies to recognize their own self-worth. And it's like, if you're not meeting their needs, they're leaving.
Yeah.
And me personally, I don't think that's a bad thing, because I think that companies should be supporting each other's needs. And if you're not, then I think that's a powerful position to put yourself in and be like, okay, no, I'm actually going to go for what I want, and I'm not going to be bullied. I'm not going to be burnt out. I'm not going to, work until my fingers bleed. I'm going to leave and do what's best for me. So I can appreciate that new mentality. And I wouldn't be surprised, like, as we keep going, this whole idea of staying at one place for 40, 50 years it's going to die out anyway. And so, and in one way where that's beneficial for the ADHD, right? Because we're job hopping anyway. And so we're job hopping anyway. And so we're just kind of meeting these new generation's expectations.
They are just catching up with us.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah, but also coming back to this thing with resume and putting only relevant stuff, I feel, and when I talk to many of my clients, they have this dilemma, like, should I put everything I've done there? And I'm like, it's not a lie if you don't list all your experience. And I think it also comes from the fact that we one of our traits is that we are very honest and very ethical and very good people sometimes,
Mm-hmm.
which can be overused by us. And
Mm-hmm.
you also, with time, I think for every human being, neurotypical or neuroatypical, it's important to be able to set your boundaries and know where there is honesty and where there is a potential undermining your ability or your opportunities. Yeah.
Yeah, and that also made me think of, we also have the tendency sometimes to overshare,
Yeah.
um, or to just because we believe that, I mean, and it's true. I mean, I'll speak for myself. It is true. Like everything that you experience in life is important, right? Just generally speaking, this is important. And sometimes we also have a hard time distinguishing what people really want to know versus, especially when we get asked like vague questions. And so if you think about your resume as like a written version of trying to not overshare, if that makes sense. So you kind of cut things out so that you make sure that you're only including the relevant content. And so that's the same thing. And that's why it's important to practice like interviewing. And so we're going to be talking about interviewing. I think we're talking about interviewing this week, interviewing with ADHD as well, and like making sure that we're not oversharing. And so being prepared for an interview and only including the relevant information within the conversation or with on paper, so that we're not confusing people or sending people down a rabbit hole that they don't need to go down. And so recognizing that you can help control the situation, you can help control the conversation. And so positioning yourself to do that versus um, versus not doing that or just allowing the conversation to just happen, because then you can end up in a rabbit hole that you don't necessarily want to be in, and that can be really confusing for an employer.
Yeah, and of course, it's also an act of self-care because when we overshare, we actually can be hurt
Mm-hmm.
when there is not enough trust built. So yeah, I just always perceive like shutting my big mouth sometimes uh, as an act of self-care of myself rather than looking at the expectations of the other person. Just doing it from your heart for yourself, I think this can ease the feeling of, oh, I didn't say something or I was hiding something.
I love that. Yeah, because it's true. You're opening yourself up for other people to ridicule or to criticize. And so how much, if that trust hasn't been built, then how do you like, make sure that you're protecting yourself in the process? Somebody had a question and said something about, I just lost it, but they were excited that you were talking a little bit about your expectations when it comes to the bragging versus not bragging because, or talking about your strengths versus not because they're going to be moving over to Munich, I think they said.
Yeah, yeah, I've seen this question. Yeah.
Um, and then some strengths-based assessments. I mean, I don't know if there's necessarily specific tools for ADHDers, but there's ones that I recommend. Um, and so, when we talk about our strengths, we talk about them in different ways. And so Jessie had mentioned the VIA character strengths tool. And so that is available on VIA, I want to say it's just via.org, but I could be making that up. But
I
just
think
look up,
it's
yeah, I
.org.
think
Yeah.
it's via.org. But it's VIA, VIA, and then character strengths. So if you Google VIA character strengths, you can do that. I actually use that in two different ways. So with the character strengths and how I describe it to people, like these are the your areas of concerns at the time or the things that you value. So I think it helps you identify what your value system is. And when you understand your value system, you can also better understand like what's going to be triggering you in particular roles. So like, if you're in a particular position, and what are one of the character strengths? I can only think about spirituality, but
Think
um,
about leadership being at the bottom, then you don't aim for being a CEO of something.
yeah. Let me see the character strengths list. So for example, they have it's yeah, it's VIA viacharacter.org. Sorry, viacharacter.org. And so there's 24 different character strengths. And so, like, for example, one of them is creativity. So, like, you know, if you are in a position where creativity is really important to you, it's one of your higher strengths, then when you're looking for or you're trying to decide whether or not to stay at a particular job, and recognizing, like, do you have the opportunity to be creative? Like, because that's really high on your list. And so that's when you start asking yourself. And so I use it with my clients in two different ways. So one, identifying, like, what is your value system? And are you positioned to be able to access those values, or are your values being triggered in that role? So asking those two different questions. But then I also, when I work with clients, I take a look at that and, like, how is it positively and negatively impacting you also within the job? And so if creativity is one of the higher things on your character, you may be positioned to be really creative, but then also sometimes you may be in a position where your creativity is not being accessed. And because it's not being accessed, now you're bored and now you're having some negative outcomes within your job. Or are you volunteering some creative uh, strategies or some creative approaches to doing your work, and that stuff isn't necessarily being welcomed within your work environment. And so, like, you know, how are your value systems being accessed or being a trigger for you within those workspaces? So the VIA character strengths is one. I always do an executive functioning assessment with my clients because I think it's important for you to really truly understand how your brain actually works. Because your VIA character strengths, like, depending on the type of time of year or your age, like, they can shift. Like, I've taken it several times and it's always shifting because it's like, what is valuable to me right now? But with your executive functions, that kind of gives you a basic idea of, like, how your brain is functioning. Like, what are your stronger executive functions? What are your weaker ones? The replay for that, because we talked about this in week 1, the replay of that will be available soon, so you can kind of better understand your executive function strengths and weaknesses and what I mean by that, because I don't want to go into it in this particular conversation. Then there's also, I mean, send me a DM if you really want a list of different assessments that you can take to better understand your strengths. Then just send me a message. Send me a message. I'm not going to remember right now, but send me a message and I will get back to you with a list of different assessments that you can take and where you can take them for free, where it may cost a little bit of money, but I can make a list. But if you don't DM me, I'm not going to do it. So DM me if I'm being honest. Let me see what other questions we have here.
I think you said that there was a question from a person who's moving to Europe, and what was the question exactly?
I'm trying to go back.
This perspective for Central Europe is important for me as I'm moving to Munich next year for business school. Yeah, I think we're gonna jump into sort of this comparison between how it looks like here to how it looks in the US, for example. But finishing the topic, at least on my side, for how to find and keep a job, I would like to highlight again this strategic job searching, which you also mentioned, that treating interview for yourself, not only for the employer, that you find out whether the job is suitable for you, not only present yourself for them. I actually used this awareness that I can interview the interviewer in a way. And when I started my work in a corporate, I chose the job which was people-oriented. I started to work as a recruiter and I was interviewing people all day long, and it was something to keep my mind engaged. I love talking to people. I'm curious about them. So that helped me stay in my job until they made me redundant. But it was much better than something which kept me tied to Excel, for example, all day long, because I know that this would be much more difficult to stay in for a longer period of time.
Thank you. Somebody had asked about interviewing. I don't want to get into it too much here. So Yams, if you're still watching, I would suggest coming back on Wednesday, October 16th at 4:30 p.m. Eastern, where we're going to be talking with Jonathan. And we're going to specifically have a whole conversation about interviewing with ADHD. So I'm going to save that question for then. And so please tune back in on Wednesday. This is my little mini commercial. Tune back in on Wednesday at 4:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time to hear all about ADHD and interviewing.
Also, what I also wrote down as important, apart from the strengths test and recognizing your strengths, it's also valuable to write the list of your values. And this is like typical coaching exercise, but listing your values and also writing a life mission statement in a few sentences, it's what really helped me to find a job and to stick to it, which is ADHD coaching.
Mm-hmm.
But when you give it a thought, you might find out that maybe your life mission is in being a florist, or I don't know, just to have this idea in your mind, what's the thing that's driving you and what's the thing you would like to show to the world in your lifetime.
Yeah, and also recognizing that you may want to show multiple things in your lifetime. And so also some other plugs, just to plug who else, like other conversations that are going to be happening the rest of this month. We are going to be talking to a creative around like her journey. I think this is on Friday. And her journey as well, and just recognizing too, like now that she has really leaned into her creative side and her business and being her authentic self, things are like the blessings are coming her way because she has really given in to who she is as an individual, and so and really has adopted her purpose. And there was something else that was coming up next week also, but check out the calendar. It's coming up. I'll mention. I don't remember right now, but what I remember, I'll bring it back up. This has been great. No problem. It's a Sade, I think. Is that how you pronounce your name? Moving to Central Europe. There were some differences too, and I was curious, and maybe this is just my curiosity getting to me, in terms of the perspective and how people perceive ADHD over in Poland. How is that perceived or accepted in the workplace and or culture there?
There is a in the soft words, there is a big room for improvement. And first of all, the awareness in the Central Europe, I'm talking mostly about Poland. I don't have much experience in other countries, but I guess it's similar. The awareness is growing, but it's only growing.
Mm-hmm.
It was on level 0 and is slowly rising. It's not as widespread as in Australia or in the US. There is a huge underdiagnosis problem. So many people suffer or are misdiagnosed for depression or anxiety, but the source, the core, is not addressed, which is being neurodivergent.
Okay.
Also, we have professionals who diagnose, like neuropsychologists, psychiatrists, but it's very rarely caught in school. It's changing slowly, but teachers are not trained yet to, like me, I was diagnosed at the age of 30, not 7, when it would change my whole life.
Yeah.
No. So this is what really makes me emotional talking about it, because so many kids, especially in the rural areas or smaller towns, they are basically in environments which are not aware of what they might suffer from.
Yeah, that sounds like somebody else is in Canada, and that it says that they're throwing the diagnosis everywhere, and it feels like I do think, I do think that there is more awareness around ADHD globally. But I do think, depending on what country you're in, you can have a completely different experience. And it's all about the different identifiers, honestly. And so depending on what you identify as and where you're at in the world, your experience can be really different. But the key is to once you have some clarity or you see a live like this and you're like, maybe I have ADHD, is to get access to get supports. And so I don't know, Justy, do you see clients internationally?
Yeah.
Yep, and I do too. So if if you're having trouble finding somebody within your own country, then a lot of ADHD coaches see people from all over the world.
Yeah.
And so that's something to keep in mind. And then I specifically work on career things as well. And so, if that's something that you find that you need support with, then I'm here for that as well. But yeah, so I support people from all over the world. So you can, no matter where you're at, no matter what the culture is and where you're at locally, you may be able to get support internationally.
Yeah, thanks to amazing technology.
Yes, yes. Thankful for the internet
Yeah.
and and all
What
of
I
the video calls.
Yeah. What I also wanted to say about Poland and Central Europe is the medication. There is a stigma around it. Like, do not medicate children. What are these drugs that they use and they are like treated as narcotics or something? I'm not
Yeah,
saying that everyone does it, but there is some sort of misconceptions like that. And it's also difficult to find the proper psychiatrist.
hmm,
Like, many psychiatrists are not trained to treat ADHD.
yeah,
And when you find one, you will be probably on a long waiting list to get to
yeah,
one. And then you will have to pay big money to get the diagnosis. So there is a lot of challenges when it comes to this.
yeah. And one thing I would say, just to piggyback off my previous comment too, is recognizing that if you do not have an ADHD diagnosis or ADHD coach, like you may not be able to get the medicine or the specific psychiatric supports that you may want if you don't have a diagnosis, depending on where you are. But ADHD coaches, a lot of them like don't also require you to have be diagnosed with ADHD to get support. So if you feel like you have ADHD or there's some more information that you want to know, ADHD coaches, a lot of them will still be able to support you in that way.
Of course.
And
Yeah.
also when you're in the job, whether or not you're looking or trying to keep one, and recognizing that you may be experiencing some impulsivity, you may be experiencing some distraction challenges, you may be experiencing some challenges with like planning and prioritizing your work or just organization, or some other common challenges that you may be experiencing within the workplace with ADHD, whether or not you're in a current position or you're looking for another one. Again, ADHD coaches or career coaches or something like that can really help support you in that way, with or without a diagnosis. And we can still have a conversation about like what strategies or supports you could have without disclosing to your employer. And it may be simple as, are you using the appropriate project management software in order to get through your work? Are you accessing the right external supports? Like, do you need, like, most likely you don't need to do everything. I mean, in life, you don't need to do everything, right? And so having a coach being able to help identify areas in your life that you can outsource some additional supports and not position yourself to feel like you need to do everything also. And so those are some other areas in which ADHD not diagnosis in the United States, in Poland, or wherever you're at in the world, can help support you navigate how to find and to keep up a job. And so, but it's all about self-awareness. Like, you have to be able to be a self-advocate and asking for that support, and knowing that there are resources out there, like the two of us that are on this call right now. And I know we're approaching an hour, and so I wanted to thank you for joining this call today and having this conversation with us about how to find and how to keep a job, and really talking about those international differences. And I appreciate that conversation. So I hope that you have appreciated this time too, Justy.
I feel so comfortable with you, Megan, that I don't want it to finish, but yeah.
Thank you. That's my other gift. My other gift is to create some comfortable space. We can always come back on and do like another talk, and we can always, and make sure we stay in contact for sure. And maybe we can do some future work together. I don't know how everybody else feels about that, but maybe we can. And I hope that everybody else is having an amazing day. And then again, if you have any other questions around how to find a job, how to keep a job, ask either of us, send us a DM. Make sure that you're following both of us on social media. The rest of the week that is coming up, I just posted the calendar. Just a quick update. So tomorrow we're going to be talking about ADHD leadership and balance and all the things that are required in order to kind of maintain a life with ADHD and work. And then we have specifically about like how to interview with ADHD. On Thursday, we have a marriage and family therapist coming in to talk about ADHD work and relationships. And then on Friday, we have the entrepreneur coming in to talk about entrepreneurship, her journey, and how accessing supports like a virtual assistant was really helpful to ensure that her business is successful. And that's just next week. I'm not going to mention the fact, well, but I am mentioning the fact that even the week after, we're going to be having a nutritionist coming in and talk about the challenges of ADHD and nutrition. We have somebody else coming, like we're all multi-talented, so we're going to be having conversations about like, what does it mean to be multi-talented with ADHD and how to, and this is really piggybacking really off this conversation, but in how to navigate those multiple interests. Who else do we have? I don't have my list in front of me, but there's really good things that are coming up for the rest of the month. So please stay tuned, and also stay tuned because the first 2-week replays are going to be up soon as well. We just had to do a little bit of editing, but they should be up soon. So please tune in because we talked a lot about therapy and how to access it, the differences between therapy and coaching. And so please, if you feel like you missed the lives, you didn't miss the content completely. So it will be accessible. You will have access to it as well. And Justy, I don't know too much about like your coaching programs and what you offer. So I don't know if you want to talk about that for half a second.
One more thing. You mentioned the woman that's gonna be our guest soon, that she, and having all this, when I mentioned the mission statement, and you, when you can put there many of your interests and passions and values, that one of my passions is writing poetry and singing in a rock band. And actually now I'm starting with my fellow coach, Elise O'Connell, we are starting a group for creatives, international group for creatives with ADHD.
I love that.
And I'm also very excited about this project. Yeah.
I love that. Yeah, make sure that you're following Justy so that you can hear more about that. That was a struggle. And I have some new coaching programs that are going to be coming up. And then on Thursday, actually, for the month of October, on Thursdays at 8 p.m. Eastern, I do have some group coaching for women with ADHD available, some slots available for that. It's an hour group coaching, super cheap. It's only $20 for this month. And that those links, if you are interested in accessing some group coaching, and you identify as a woman with ADHD, or you're a woman who thinks that they have ADHD, then that is available to you at 8:30 p.m. on Thursdays for the next 2 Thursdays. So I look forward to seeing you during those group coaching sessions. But that's all we got for today, folks.
Thank you, Megan.
I hope that everybody enjoyed this conversation. I'm just going to scroll up.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you. We're going to sign off. All right.
Okay. Bye.
Thanks. Bye.